Innovation and Marxism, the journey. All right, we're going to first talk about the word socialism. A lot of people think the word socialism and the word Marxism and the word communism are all synonymous. That is not the truth. The word socialism goes back pretty far, goes back to the early 1800s, and it goes back to France. In France in 1789, you had the French Revolution, in which the king of France got his head chopped off, in which they declared the rights of man, liberté, égalité, fraternity, freedom, egalitarianism, and brotherhood, right? Those were the slogans of the French Revolution. And they said that on the back of feudalism in France, they were going to create a fair and just society. And they were going to do it in the name of individual rights and the rights of man. But they didn't get it. And after the French Revolution, after the king had had his head chopped off, after they had killed a lot of the aristocrats and nobles and declared freedom of religion and freedom of speech, they still had a really, really unjust society. There was a lot of hunger, there was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of injustice that existed. And a lot of the injustice that existed, it seemed like people almost had no obligation to each other. The rallying cry of the French Revolution had largely been a fight for individual rights and individualism. And so after the French Revolution, there was a philosopher, a guy named Henry Saint-Simon. Looks like Simon, but it's French, so it's pronounced Simone. Henry Saint-Simon. And he started contrasting the liberalism and individualism of the New World that came out of the French Revolution with a society, with his understanding of something opposing that, and he called it socialism, right? The word social means society, right? If you're socializing, you're with other people, right? Social is in relation to society. And so he contrasted, he said we need, instead of having individualism and liberalism, we need to have socialism. Now, he wasn't exactly clear about what socialism was. He largely did a lot of charity work. He fed poor people, fed the hungry. He was very religious. He also set up some worker cooperative businesses. He called for, laws to protect poor people from being mistreated by their employers. And in French, he had this concept of socialism. And it was vague. No one really understood what it was. It was just a critique of the brave new world that came into existence after the French Revolution. The first person to use the word socialism in English was a guy named Robert Owen. And Robert Owen was a wealthy man from Wales, and he owned a bunch of factories, but he saw that the workers in his factories were treated very, very badly. And so he set up a model community in Scotland, in New Lanark. He set up this model community where all the people were equal and held the wealth in common. And eventually they packed up and they moved to Indiana, and they called it New Harmony. And they had a socialist collective city in New Harmony. And Robert Owen, he was a critic of mainstream religion, but he was also into spiritualism. He thought he could talk to dead people. He would have seances and talk to dead people. And, he was an advocate for the poor, an advocate for the downtrodden. He built a modern city. And he even gave a speech to a joint session of Congress. They invited him to the U.S. Congress to give a speech about socialism. And his speech was all about how there's inequality out there and we should hold the wealth in common. Again, kind of vaguely defined, but he built this model city called New Harmony where the people shared everything. And that was socialism. And at the time, coming out of the French Revolution, all across the Western countries, United States, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, places like that. In the big cities, you had what you called the revolutionary intelligentsia. And this had come out of, in the lead up to the French Revolution, people had gathered to discuss ideas. And they gathered in these places they called salons, which were places where people would gather and debate about, what does freedom mean? What does human rights mean? Where does truth come from? And as a result of the salons that had developed and led up to the French Revolution, after the French Revolution, in most Western countries, in the big cities like Paris and Vienna and London and Rome and Venice and New York City and places like that, you had a group of people that were sitting around talking about ideas, basically. They were just debating ideas. And a lot of these people were what they call idlers. idlers. Now, those are individuals of significant wealth who do not have to work. And it was a big phenomenon in the 1800s. People whose parents were wealthy capitalists, they didn't have to work. And so they sat around in wealthy areas, bored, basically, talking to other wealthy people, debating ideas. And there was a whole culture that developed of entertaining idlers, right? These wealthy rich people would sit around and, they would hire hypnotists to hypnotize them. And, they would hire spiritualists to help them talk to the dead. And they would, they were very interested in going to operas, and they attended operas. And among the idlers, there was a minority of idlers, of very wealthy people who had a lot of time to just sit around and, be entertained. They didn't have to work. Among the idlers, there was a small minority of them that were very interested in social justice. And among the wealthy idlers of Europe, in Berlin, in Vienna, and in Paris, there was one wealthy idler named Frederick Engels. And Frederick Engels' father was a wealthy factory owner. And Frederick Engels was a rich kid, the child of multimillionaires, and he didn't have to work. And he was young, and he was interested in social justice. He was interested in socialism. And there were a lot of different people running around talking to the idlers and entertaining the rich people and the revolutionary intellectuals about socialism. And they all had different ideas about what socialism was. And so they were all arguing about which type of socialism was the best. Well, Frederick Engels was one of these rich people, and he listened to different intellectuals, different writers about socialism, and he ran into Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was one wealthy intellectual socialist who was hanging around these circles. He was in Germany at first, and then he moved to Paris, and he was in London for a while. And Karl Marx was just a guy who wrote pamphlets and books about socialism and was very interested in socialism, etc. And Frederick Engels, the young wealthy idler Frederick Engels, met Karl Marx. And Karl Marx at the time was trying to show that his form of socialism was the best, because there were so many other types. And so if you look at Karl Marx's pamphlets, they're largely polemics against other socialists, right? There's a polemic called the poverty of philosophy. And that's because there was another famous socialist anarchist, a guy named Proudhon, who'd written a book called The Philosophy of Poverty and coined the phrase, poverty is theft. So Karl Marx lampooned his type of socialism. He said it's wrong. And so he wrote The Poverty of Philosophy and debunked it. And there's a whole lot of that. And that Karl Marx was going around these intellectual circles arguing about philosophy, arguing about revolution and socialism. And Engels became convinced that Karl Marx's brand of socialism was the best. And they called it scientific socialism. Now, why did they call it scientific socialism? Because to be scientific at this time meant you were modern and new, right? They were coming out of feudalism. It was the age of reason. The Catholic Church was viewed as this oppressive institution that was, holding back revolution. This was the age of reason, the age of the Enlightenment. So to be scientific meant it was really good. And that Karl Marx based his understanding of what socialism was on dialectical and historical materialism. First of all, he argued that the nature of reality was that all that existed was matter. He rejected any spirituality. There is no God, there is no spirituality, there's no power of thought. It's all just matter. But that matter is constantly contrasting itself, clashing, right? In ancient philosophy, going back to ancient Greece, there was a debate. Is the brain reacting to material, or is material created by the brain, right? And that's materialism versus idealism. Idealism says the mind creates reality. Materialism says the mind is a physical thing that just reflects the reality that's already there. And Marx was a materialist. He said, the only reason you think is because you have a piece of matter in your brain, that is called a brain that does thinking. Thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, and that thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that is a reflection of hard material reality, right? But he argues that material is constantly in a state of contradiction. It's constantly clashing. and that it's through the clash and the conflict that history advances. And dialectical materialism, this understanding that all that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion and constantly clashing against itself. That leads to the notion of historical materialism, which is that human civilization is constantly advancing to a higher stage. Human beings are moving toward a higher mode of production. And, just as, hunter-gatherer civilization was eventually replaced by slavery, and slavery was replaced by feudalism. Feudalism was replaced by capitalism. Eventually, out of that will come socialism. And the main thing, and this is the important thing, what set Karl Marx separate from all the other socialists? What was it that Karl Marx, with his complex ideas of dialectical and historical materialism and all of this, his scientific socialism, what was the conclusion that Marx came to that set him apart from all the other socialists going around, from Proudhon, from Auguste Bebel, from all these people going around talking about different ideas about what socialism is? Robert Owen, Henry Saint-Simon, Franz Fourier. What made Marx different? Marx said socialism will come out of the labor movement. That was the defining characteristic of Marxism. All these other people said socialism will be created by it being a good idea. We're just going to go around telling people that socialism is better, and they're going to see that it's better and they'll adopt it. Maybe we'll take control of the government and we'll use the government to create socialism. Maybe we'll build a model community. But everybody else basically said socialism is going to be just something that comes out of our head, right? It's going to be a battle of ideas. Whereas Karl Marx, with his scientific socialism, he's saying it's actually the struggle between the factory worker and the factory owner. That is what is going to lead to socialism, that the factory worker is not paid the full value of what he produces. The capitalist system has built-in economic problems. There's more goods created than purchasing power paid out in wages, and the worker can never buy back what he produces, and that eventually the labor movement is going to lead to the worker class majority taking control of the government and creating socialism. That is what defined Marxism. That is what separated Karl Marx from all the other socialists. All the other socialists believed that socialism would come through the power of ideas. Karl Marx believed socialism would come through the labor movement. And basically what happened is that, Friedrich Engels and started paying for Karl Marx's work, and Karl Marx was going around trying to recruit all the rich people and all the people that were interested in socialism to go build labor unions and go organize labor unions and eventually have a working class political party that would represent the working class in the government, and that eventually the working class would seize control of the government. That's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that was the defining aspect of Marx, is that Marx believed socialism and communism would be achieved through the labor movement. And so all socialism is not Marxism. Many, many people were socialists long before Karl Marx was ever around. Karl Marx is the guy who said it would come through struggle. It would come through the labor movement. And when Marxism emerged, Marxism was the struggle to create a mass labor movement as a way to achieve socialism. That the labor unions, the Chartist movement, all these mass movements of workers demanding pay from their employers, that would be the basis of it. So Karl Marx, he created the First International, which was an attempt to get working class revolutionary activists from many different countries in Europe united into one single organization, the International Working Men's Association, the First International. And it was around for a little bit, 1864 to 1876, lasted about 12 years, but there was a huge amount of infighting between different factions, anarchists who just wanted a bloody revolution, the people that just wanted pure and simple trade unionism, didn't want to actually build a revolutionary movement. There was a whole lot of infighting, and eventually the First International fell apart. However, shortly after Karl Marx died, there was something called the Second International that was created in 1889, and it's still around today. It's called the Socialist International. And the movement that really came out of Karl Marx is called social democracy. Right after Karl Marx died, 1889, you had the German Social Democratic Party, you had the British Labour Party, you had the Austrian Social Democratic Party, you had the Labour Party of Belgium, and you had the Labour Party of all these different places. you eventually had socialist and labor and social democratic parties emerging all over Europe. And these were political parties that represented labor unions. That was basically what they were. They were political parties, and their job, their goal was to get elected to the government and eventually build a mass labor movement so the working class could take control of the government. That was the idea, that they would have a labor movement, and the labor movement would form a political party, and the political party and the labor unions would eventually rise up and take control of the government. And that movement is called social democracy, and it still exists. And it's actually one of the biggest political movements in the Western world. Democratic Socialists of America is part of social democracy. They were members of the Socialist International for a long time. The British Labour Party, the German Social Democrats, the French Socialist Party. And, it's a widespread belief that we should have a political party that represents labor unions, that the government should pass laws that favor working people. That's what came out of Marxism, right? Again, a lot of people think, well, the only thing that ever came out of Marxism was Lenin. That's not true. There's this whole other movement called social democracy. That was the first thing that came out of Marxism. But social democracy hit a brick wall, right? It hit a brick wall because there was the crisis of Marxism. In early 1900, socialism was everywhere. The social democratic parties, the labor parties were everywhere. The labor unions were growing in big numbers, but there wasn't any revolution. And they didn't have any revolution. And in fact, what Marx had predicted was not coming true. Marx had predicted that in Germany and France and Britain and America, the poor would just keep getting poorer, and it would result in a situation where the workers would have no choice but to overthrow capitalism and establish the government. But that didn't happen. And in fact, what was happening was that a lot of working people, not the majority, but a significant number of working people were having their income go up. And capitalism was becoming more stable, not less stable. It was becoming more economically stable. And as a result, you were not having a revolution. Communism, socialist movements, Marxist groups, labor unions, social democrats, they were everywhere. Millions of people were joining these groups. The German Social Democratic Party was the largest political party in the world at this point. No other political party of any type was as big as the German Social Democrat Party, started by Friedrich Engels was, but people weren't interested in having a revolution. So what's going on? What's the problem? And there were different attempts to explain what was happening. One of the biggest arguments was a guy named Edward Bernstein, and he said that, actually Marx had it wrong. It's not a revolution, it's just reform. That capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism one step at a time. And that because we have universal male suffrage, because every man can vote, that will lead to a situation where there's more workers than there are capitalists. The workers will just outvote the capitalists, and we'll have socialism. And socialism is just the sum of reforms. It's like a brick wall, right? One day you have free healthcare, one day you have labor unions, one day you have universal free education, and the next thing you know, it's socialism, but there's no revolution. It just kind of naturally emerges, right? That was Bernstein's argument, and that was called revisionism. And a lot of Marxists became revisionists because they said, look, we're not seeing the revolution, and we have universal male suffrage, and we have a 12-hour workday, and we have all these things that sound awful to us now. So basically, the Western countries are just kind of naturally becoming socialist anyway. And there were some Marxists that went along with that, and that became a pretty widespread view. However, there was one guy who definitely didn't agree with that view, and that guy was Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was let's just talk about Vladimir Lenin for a second, right? Lenin is very famous, right? He's in Hollywood movies, and, you see images of him, there's paintings and all of that. Lenin was a very socially awkward person. He had a speech impediment. He had a lisp when he spoke, and he was obsessive. He was obsessive with politics. One of his critics said, "What are you going to do with a guy who talks, writes, thinks, and breathes nothing but revolution 24 hours a day?" That's how Lenin was. He was an obsessive, socially awkward person with a speech impediment, and he had fits of nervousness, huge amounts of anxiety. He wouldn't sleep for days. And when he would get really, really upset, he would calm himself down by playing the piano and by playing chess. And he was quite emotionally wrapped up in what he did. And he was this guy who had joined the Marxist movement in Russia. And he was obsessed. He was obsessive. He was a socially awkward, obsessive individual. And he was obsessive. And he definitely did not believe in revisionism. He did not believe that capitalism in the West was just naturally turning into socialism. And Lenin was from a quite revolutionary family. His older brother had actually gotten the death penalty because he tried to kill the Tsar. His brother had become an anarchist terrorist and had tried to kill the Tsar and gotten the death penalty. And as a result, Lenin's family had been made into social pariahs. They'd lived in a town where there was a university, and they were a well-known family. But when his older brother tried to kill the Tsar, people wouldn't speak to them. And so at a time when he was a teenager, basically, he was like socially shunned by all of society. And that's Lenin, right? And we have this image of Lenin as the great agitator, as the great organizer. That's not who Lenin was. Lenin was just a very, very obsessed, socially awkward, very, very anxious guy, who was really, really, really into Marxism. And Lenin said, no, capitalism isn't just naturally turning into socialism. No, he rejected Bernsteinism completely. And in 1903, he decided that they needed a new type of revolutionary organization in Russia. They needed the party of new type. And so in London, a bunch of Russians who had, gotten arrested or been persecuted by the Tsar moved to London, and they were living in London because that's where they were exiled, right? And they were living in London. And so Lenin got together all the Russian Marxists living in London, and he got them in a room, and he pitched them on his idea to form the party of new type. And his idea was that they were going to form an organization that was basically a secret society for people who would give the whole of their lives to revolution. And this organization would have one newspaper to represent its views. And this organization would require you to obey orders. If you didn't agree with what the party was doing, you either did what the party said or you left the organization. You didn't have the option of picking and choosing what you believed. They had one newspaper to speak for the whole organization. They didn't have a bunch of privately owned newspapers owned by different people. They had one voice for the organization. They would engage in agitation to the masses, to stir up the masses to rebel. And they would look among the masses for the best and the brightest, and they would propagate to them. It was quite a method that he pitched. He said, I'm going to form this new organization, and we're going to use all these methods, and we're going to be highly disciplined. It'll be only for people who give the whole of their lives and all of this. And the majority of the people in the room said, sign me up. And the minority of the people in the room said, no, we don't want to do this. And so from then on, Lenin's organization were called the Bolsheviks, and the other organization that didn't accept this, the people that didn't accept it among the Russian Marxists, they were called the Mensheviks. And that's what they were known as, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Now that gets interesting. That gets a little bit interesting because the majority of Marxists in Russia didn't agree with Lenin. It was just the majority of the people in the room. So this is where it gets confusing. The Bolsheviks were the majority of the people in the room, but among Russian Marxists, they were the minority. And the Mensheviks, they were the minority of people in the room in London, but they were the majority among the Russian Marxists. So it's all backwards. But regardless, Lenin's group were called the Bolsheviks, and they had this whole new political organization theory, this whole new organizational method called the Party of New Type. Now, the Party of New Type is kind of contradictory to what Marx believed. Marx was an advocate of total freedom and total freedom of speech. Marx wanted to completely get rid of the death penalty. And Marx was all about open debate and passing resolutions and Robert's Rules of Order and all of that. And Lenin's Party of New Type, no, there's no debate. Once we resolve the question, once the debate is over, the matter is closed, and you carry it out or you get out of the group. And that people saw the Party of New Type that Lenin created as very non-Western and very Russian. In Russia, there's a whole history of secret societies. The Old Believers. right? When the Russian Orthodox Church changed its beliefs, there were a number of Russian Orthodox folks who held on to their beliefs, and they were called the Old Believers. And the Old Believers, they had secret signs and secret codes. The men among the Old Believers, they refused to cut their beards. And so in Russia, they in the 1800s, or when they were suppressing the Old Believers, there was a fine. If you had a beard, a long beard like Old Believers did, you had to pay a fine. There was a beard tax, and then you had to have a token, and the police would stop you. And if you didn't have your token, then they would arrest you or whatever. And you had to pay your beard tax. It was like a penalty you had to pay for having a beard, because the Russian Orthodox Church no longer promoted beards. And there were the Decembrists. This was another secret society that had, tried to overthrow one of the, I think, Tsar Nicholas I. They'd attempted a coup. And so in Russia, they had a whole history of secret societies, secret orders, traditional kind of things. And the Party of New Type was not Western. It was not liberal. It was not open. And after the Party of New Type, the Bolsheviks, was formed, Lenin came up with this new theory. And he explained how it was, why it was that what Marx predicted wasn't coming true. He said Marx had thought that capitalism in the Western countries would eventually lead to an economic crisis, and the workers would rise up and overthrow their bosses, and they'd have a revolution. What Marx didn't understand is that capitalism has entered a new stage called imperialism, and that now the big corporations and the big banks in Western countries are going all over the world, and as a result, they've been able to buy off a big chunk of the workers at home, the aristocracy of labor. And so the revolutionary energy is not going to be in the Western countries. It's going to be in the Eastern countries. And that the fight is not against just regular capitalism. It's against imperialism. It's against these big monopolies that are dominating the world. And the countries around the world, colonized and oppressed countries, are going to have socialism to break out of imperialism. This is completely contrary to what Marx taught. Marx taught that socialism came from the labor movement, came from the workers fighting the bosses. Lenin says that because of imperialism, socialism is going to come from struggles of national liberation. It'll be oppressed nations fighting against imperialism that'll adopt socialism. This is a completely new theory, right? And Marx said that Germany would be the first communist country. The Communist Manifesto ends with, "Now we turn to Germany." Marx thought, the West was going to be communist first because it was the most advanced. But Lenin said, nope. In the West, the imperialist monopolies have bought off a section of the working class. And so the working class is divided. And so the revolutionary energy is going to be in the East. And Lenin goes as far as to say we must support nationalism. Nationalism of oppressed countries is good. Marx and others had said workers of the world unite. There are no nations. Now, Marx had eventually realized that the Irish national struggle was good. He'd also realized that the Polish national struggle was good. But for most of Marx's life, and most of the Marxist movement said nationalism, all nationalism is bad. But Lenin said nationalism is bad in Europe, right? It's bad for the Germans, it's bad for the British, it's bad for the Italians. But African nationalism, if they're fighting the imperialists, that's great. Indian nationalism, it's great. Asian nationalism, nationalism in South America, that's good because it'll lead fights of national liberation that will have to have socialism because imperialism dominates the world. So Lenin, basically, he has this whole new organization. They're going to run their organization as a secret society that's really strict, and the way it's all set up, that's completely not the way Marx did things. On top of that, he's saying we're not fighting regular capitalism. It's not the workers versus the bosses. It's the colonized people of the world fighting for national liberation. He changed everything. And, he drew heavily from Marx's understanding of economics, and he pulled from places where Marx said things that were similar to what he said. But Leninism, what Lenin did, and Bolshevism was a whole new thing. And increasingly, the Bolsheviks, that you have to remember, this is the most important thing. The Bolsheviks were viewed as a bunch of freaks by the global Marxist movement, right? The global communist movement thought the Bolsheviks were a bunch of weirdos, that they were a bunch of freaks, they were a bunch of weirdos. People frequently pointed out, they said the Bolsheviks, they said they're not a revolutionary party. They're a monastic religious order. They compared them to like the Franciscans, right? Or the Jesuits or something. And they called them a cult, and they called them weird and authoritarian and Russian. And they have this whole new theory about imperialism. And if you join, you have to give the whole of your life. And everything about the Bolsheviks, they were completely different than European Marxism. There was a movement at the time called Marxism, and the Bolsheviks were this weird spin-off and deviation of Marxism. And that is a really important thing. And you won't know this by reading their writings. The Bolsheviks were constantly trying to say, no, we're the real Marxists. The other Marxists have sold out. If Marx was alive, he would be in our movement. We're the true Marxists. So if you read what they wrote, you don't get that understanding. Yeah, you would think that they're the real Marxists. But the global Marxist movement thought the Bolsheviks were weirdos. They thought they were deviants. They thought they were freaks. They thought their interpretation of Marxism was bizarre. They thought things that were completely at odds with what Marxists thought. Marxists thought you should have open, free, debating society of political parties. Marxists thought the most advanced capitalist countries would be socialist first. Marxists thought nationalism was always bad. Workers of the world unite. Marxists thought, it's going to come as a fight between the factory worker and the factory owner. The Bolsheviks, what they believed was a freak interpretation of Marxism, right? They were, you can compare it to, right, Mormons. Are Mormons Christians? Well, they consider themselves to be Christians, but they have a whole new Bible, right? The Book of Mormon. They have a whole new prophet, Joseph Smith. And so, yeah, they talk about Jesus and all of that, but they took it in a completely different direction. The Bolsheviks were the Mormons of communism, of Marxism. And that's what you need to remember, right? Marxism was the foundation, but they had a whole new prophet, Lenin. They had a whole new interpretation. They were doing something very, very different on the foundation of Marxism. And that you must remember that, because if you don't understand that, nothing is going to make sense. People say to me, well, Caleb, did you know that the Labour Party in Britain is a socialist party? Yeah, I do know that, actually. They're part of the Second International, but they're not Leninists, right? And they said, Caleb, did you know that, the DSA is this new socialist group? I said, yeah, they are, but they're not Leninists. They're from the Second International. They're social democracy. What Marx created was watered down and became social democracy. And Lenin was this weird deviant within Marxism that came up with his whole new theory that laid the foundation for his own movement that was called Bolshevism. And the difference between Marxism as an established movement, the biggest Marxist party in the world was the German Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party. And the differences between Marxism and Bolshevism became most apparent when World War I took place. All the socialist parties of Europe had promised they would never support World War I. They would never support World War I, right? They would never support workers going to kill other workers. And then World War I came along, and they said, whoopsie daisy, and they forgot all about that, and they supported World War I. Okay? And if you go and read Lenin's writings from around 1916, 1914, 1915, he is filled with rage. And if you go and read his writings, Lenin points out that World War I would never have happened without the socialists, without the Marxist parties. They let it happen. They enabled it to happen. If the German Social Democratic Party had stood up against World War I, they could have stopped it. If the British Labour Party had stood up against World War I, they could have stopped it. If the socialist members of Congress in the United States had stood up against World War I and stood with Eugene Debs, they could have stopped it. That World War I, they needed the socialists to make it happen. The socialists recruited the labor unions and recruited the workers to go and fight. And that is an essential thing. And if you read Lenin, he makes this point. It's not simply a matter of the Marxists abandoned their principles. They were an essential part of imperialism. This economic system of imperialism needed socialists to be part of it, right? It needed corrupt union bosses. It needed socialist college professors. It needed people that could speak like working class revolutionaries to make it work. And World War I would never have happened without socialists. So the idea that Lenin is just another Marxist, no, the overwhelming majority of the Marxists supported World War I. And Lenin opposed World War I, and he fumed with rage at the Marxist movement for supporting World War I. And fumed with rage, how dare they? He called the Second International, he called it a stinking corpse. And he just, fumed with rage. And again, I told you that Lenin was, somebody who was very emotional, wouldn't sleep for days, had fits of anxiety, so you can imagine, if you go and read anything Lenin wrote, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, on the Collapse of the Second International. He is screaming with rage at the Marxist movement because they sold out. And actually, there's a quote from him that I frequently use. I think I can put it on the screen if I can find the image. There's a quote from one of his essays. It's one of my favorite quotes. I've used it many times before. Because it is just so important. Right? Yeah, here we go. Yeah, this is the quote that Lenin says. Neither we nor anyone else can calculate precisely what portion of the proletariat is following and will follow the social chauvinists and opportunists. This will be revealed only by the struggle, and it will be definitely decided only by the socialist revolution. But we know for certain that the defenders of the fatherland in imperialist war represent only a minority, and it is therefore our duty, if we wish to remain socialists, to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. This is the whole meaning and the whole purport of the struggle against opportunism. By exposing the social chauvinists and opportunists who are in reality betraying and selling the interests of the masses, that they are defending the temporary privileges of a minority of workers, that they are vehicles of bourgeois ideas and influences, they're really allies and agents of the bourgeoisie. We teach the masses to appreciate their true political interests and to fight for socialism through all the long and painful vicissitudes of imperialist war and imperialist armistice. He's saying we don't even want to be part of this fake socialist movement. We want to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. He basically is saying we have nothing to do with this social democratic movement that is leading workers off to die in World War I. There's two distinct movements. There's three distinct movements now. First, you have socialism, which is just this vague critique of Western liberal society. Out of socialism, you get Marxism, which is the belief that socialism, some kind of egalitarian society, can be created through the labor movement. And out of Marxism, you get yet another movement called Bolshevism. And Bolshevism is this weird interpretation of Marxism in Europe, with the party of new type, with the theory of imperialism, with the theory of supporting national liberation, that revolutionary energy is in the colonized world and in the East rather than the West. Bolshevism is yet a third movement. Well, what happened is in 1917, there was some weird historical circumstances. One thing led to another. And as a result of the revolutionary crisis of World War I, as a result of the Germans giving Lenin a huge amount of money and sending him back to Russia, Lenin was living in Switzerland, and the German intelligence, the German spies met with him and said, hey, do you want to go back to Russia and stir up trouble? And they put him on a train and gave him a bunch of money and sent him back there. And as a result of divisions within the Russian ruling class, some in Russia wanted to do business with Germany and didn't think Germany was their enemy. And as a result of all kinds of different circumstances, this weird spin-off of Marxism called Bolshevism took power in Russia in 1917. Okay? And again, how did it happen? There are so many what ifs that you can do, right? Like if this hadn't happened, if that hadn't happened, it's almost a weird historical accident. But it's based on the fact that Lenin was obsessed, right? Lenin was obsessed with making a revolution. He thought about nothing but making a revolution 24 hours a day, right? What are you to do with a guy who talks, writes, thinks, and breathes nothing but revolution 24 hours a day? And he was obsessed with, figuring out how, to do it. And, they made the best of the crisis. And as a result of a number of weird circumstances, the Bolsheviks took power. So what happened next? The Bolsheviks took power and they created the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, they announced they were forming a new international, the Third International, right? The Third International, right? That Marx had the First International, there'd been the Second International. Now they were forming the Third International. And after Lenin died, the Third International declared its ideology to be Marxism-Leninism. And Marxism-Leninism is a little bit different than what you can call Bolshevism. Bolshevism was this movement in Russia, that Lenin had created. The party of new type, the theory of imperialism, etc. But the Soviet government came into existence, and the Soviet government, its ideology that it promoted all over the world, that the Communist International promoted, was called Marxism-Leninism, right? And it was the teachings of Karl Marx, the teachings of Lenin, as practiced by the Soviet government, right? And so it's a little bit different. And so let's talk about Marxism-Leninism, right? So they formed the Communist International. To join the Communist International, you have to agree with 21 points that Lenin came up with that you must agree with in order to join the Communist International. And after Lenin dies, there is a fight against Trotsky, and there's a fight against Bukharin. So after Lenin dies, the question is, what should the Soviet Union do? What should they do? Trotsky comes forward, and he had the theory of permanent revolution, that they should basically turn the Soviet Union into a base area to spread communism to the Western countries, because that's where it counts, right? That the Soviet Union was too poor to have socialism. The peasantry is a reactionary class. Peasants can't make a revolution. So basically, Trotsky wanted to create a militarized economy, and he wanted the Soviet Union to basically become a base for exporting communism to the Western countries. Well, the population of Russia was very weary of war. They didn't want that, right? They didn't want that. They didn't want to march communism into Europe. They wanted their living standards to go up, and the Russian Civil War was horrendous. Millions of people died. There was a barricade. People were starving and desperate. They couldn't get medicine, and the idea, we're just going to have war until the end, it wasn't going to fly. What Trotsky was proposing, his theory of the permanent revolution, was rejected. After Trotsky, there was a guy named Bukharin, and Bukharin said, we're too poor, and so basically what we need to do is we need to bring foreign investment in, and we need to have capitalism. We need foreign countries to just start investing here, and we'll tax them and we'll regulate them, and eventually our economy will get big enough, then we can have socialism. And Trotsky was the left opposition, and he was defeated, and Bukharin was the right opposition, and he was also defeated. And what came into power was Stalin, and Stalin had what he called socialism in one country. And socialism in one country became what Marxism-Leninism became synonymous with. A new economic and political system came into the world, starting in 1928, pioneered up into the 1930s. After World War II, it spread all over the world. It's a new political system that had never existed before, and it was largely Stalin who invented it. He drew heavily from Lenin's theories, etc., but Stalin was the guy running the government. And he developed a very, very effective model for running a country. And this model was called, it was a communist government, Marxist-Leninist government. And basically the way it is there's one party, the Communist Party, that runs the country. And there's a very charismatic leader of the Communist Party. And then the Communist Party mobilizes 5-year economic plans, where they mobilize the country to go out and build. People get rewarded for working really, really hard. And people go out and they build and they construct. And the leader of the country, Stalin, or later Fidel Castro or Kim Il-sung, goes around rewarding people for working really, really hard. If you work really hard, you get a cash bonus, you get a reward, you get a medal. And there's one party, and they have a 5-year economic plan. And this model, what you call really existing socialism, is very good at industrializing countries. If a country's never had running water and electricity, if a country's never had paved roads, if it's never had universal literacy, this system is very good at getting it. And the Soviet Union during the 1930s, they had 5-year economic plans that were very successful, and millions of people got modern housing, got electricity, got running water, got literacy because of the Soviet Union, because of Stalin. The 5-year economic plans were brilliant, and no country had ever rapidly industrialized the way the Soviet Union did. I will show this clip. It's one of my favorite clips. It's from a PBS documentary, because this clip shows, people who lived through it describing what it was like. And this is a side of the story we never hear in America, right? They always tell us, oh, everyone was poor and starving. They tell you every horror story. Well, this is the other side of the story. This is why Stalin is still wildly popular in Russia. This is why, millions of people joined the communist parties of the world. When the rest of the planet was having a Great Depression during the 1930s, the Soviet Union rapidly became an industrial power.
To produce engineers and technicians for the new society, training was expanded, and the communists said women should have equality with men, with equal pay. Ella Shistya was one of a new generation of women.
Когда Ленин сказал, стране нужна электрификация, а коммунизм это советская...
When Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans, I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it.
Она давала мне...
The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study.
Она давала мне право трудиться, учиться так, как я хочу.
Fyodorova was held up as an example to others.
We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have. Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Teams of young activists were sent to the country.
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people. We made a note of their names. We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
Просто-напросто была огромная.
For Valentina Mikova and Mikhail Arkhipov, these were the most fulfilling days of their lives.
На строительстве домен был один экскаватор. И то плохой.
There was one excavator at the blast furnace building site, and it wasn't always reliable. So we dug all the foundations by hand.
Понимаете, копошатся люди.
The trench would be teeming with people. One takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5 or 6 levels. That was how we got the earth out of the trench. Then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
Yeah, and, you know, I mean, I discovered this. I mean, you know, people around the world know this, but in the United States, you would never know this. I remember, you know, when I was a student, when I was a young person, my family, we hosted an exchange student, a university student from Bulgaria, and he was very anti-communist. But I remember I asked him, I said, is there anyone in Bulgaria who still believes in communism? And he said, oh, yeah, my grandfather. And I said, what do you mean? And he talked about how his grandfather had fought in World War II. And after World War II, all the young men of Bulgaria were put to work building the roads of Bulgaria because Bulgaria had never had paved roads before. And so all the young people of the country went out and paved the roads of the country. And it was one of the best things he could ever remember was when he was a young man going from town to town in the country, paving the roads of the country. And it was a moment of national pride. They were all working together to build up the roads. And his grandfather, it was like the best years of his life, paving the roads of the country. And until communism came to Bulgaria, they didn't have paved roads in much of the country. And it was communism that built it. And it was communism that electrified many countries. And this system of what you call really existing socialism, Stalinism, whatever you want to call it, is very, very effective at raising people out of poverty. And they lie about this endlessly in US media. You would never know this, right? And that's what infuriates me, is they make it sound like, it just never worked anywhere. Everyone was just poor and starving. I learned at a very young age that's not actually true. The Soviet Union had huge economic successes and huge economic growth. So has China. So have many countries with communist governments. They have raised a lot of people up. They have wiped out illiteracy. And the problems that they have are in addition to huge economic successes. And nobody ever talks about that. And that's why right-wing anti-communism annoys me, because they just deny reality. You can say something and that doesn't make it true. And, and whatever criticisms you want to make without, with centrally planned economies, this Marxist-Leninist political system has had very effective economic results. After the Third International was created, as the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing with the 5-year plans, they had the Great Depression in the Western countries, and the governments that were the parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, they had from 1928 to 1935, they had what was called the Third Period, where they focused on opposing social democracy, right? Exposing social democracy as the enemy within, right? They argued that social democrats were trying to hold off the revolution. And so, they called social democrats social fascists. And they tried to build what they called the United Front from below. And they organized unemployed workers to demand jobs and education and relief. And millions of people were unemployed in America and Britain and Germany. They had huge hunger marches demanding, benefits. In America, they had the famous bonus army where thousands of veterans occupied the National Mall, demanding that they be paid veterans benefits. Social security, all these things that we enjoy largely come from what the communists did during the Third Period. They built these mass movements of desperately poor people demanding that they get food, demanding that they get fed, veterans, others, right? However, as a result of the Great Depression and the economic crisis and the threat of communist revolution, Germany, 1933, Hitler took power in Germany. And Italy already had a fascist dictatorship. And a lot of the governments of the Western countries, there was a big faction within the government that openly wanted to set up a fascist dictatorship to prevent communist revolution. And ultimately, the fascists wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. Now, many people don't know this. When Italy and Germany and Japan, when they signed an alliance, what was it called? What was the actual name of the alliance? Now, you'll never hear this, but what was the name of the alliance between the fascist countries? What did they call themselves? They called themselves, this is the Wikipedia page about it, even Wikipedia has to admit this, they called themselves the Anti-Comintern Pact. Right? Well, Caleb, communism and fascism are the same thing. The Anti-Comintern Pact was the name of the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan were the Anti-Comintern Pact. Doesn't get more obvious than that, right? And so the Anti-Comintern Pact was formed, the fascist countries. And so in the Western countries, the communists switched their tactic very dramatically. And instead, they started forming what they called the Popular Front. And the Popular Front was the strategy that basically they argued capitalism, the Western system, was naturally moving toward fascism. But most people don't want a fascist dictatorship. They want democracy. They want freedom. And so communists would position themselves as the leader of the struggle against fascism. And that would lead to them having a revolution. And that was actually a very effective strategy. And in many countries, when Nazis invaded, the communists led the resistance to them, and they became the leaders, right? Yugoslavia was invaded by the Nazis, and the Yugoslavian people fought the Nazis, and the people leading them were the communists. And afterwards, the communists ran Yugoslavia. Albania was invaded by the Nazis, and after, it was invaded, the people of Albania started fighting back, and the people leading the resistance were the Albanians, and so they took power, right? You can read, there's a great book about it. I recommend, actually, the history of the Party of Labor of Albania, Enver Hoxha, right? You can read all about how they basically, the fascists invaded, and they turned that into to a way to take power. And across Eastern Europe, right? The Soviet Red Army would liberate a country, and then they would put the various anti-fascist parties in power. But the Soviet Union would start funding them and building their power plants, etc., and they become part of the Warsaw Pact, and eventually the communists would be in power, right? And that strategy, called the Popular Front, was a really dramatic shift in communist strategy. And we will get back to this later, but I want to show you, this was Madison Square Garden in 1939. This is Madison Square Garden. I've shown this picture many, many times, but it's very, very important, right? One of the first the first public CPI event we ever had. We actually made our own version of this. We made our own Lincoln head at the front of the room, right? That was Madison Square Garden in 1939. And, what does it say there? At the top, it says security, democracy, friendship between the people of the USA and the USSR, right? And the communists completely changed their messaging style. They became ultra patriotic, right? They loved Abraham Lincoln. They were the defenders of American democracy, and fascism was un-American because America was a democratic country. And they would say that if George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln were alive today, they would be members of the Communist Party. And they were fighting for democracy, and they were fighting against fascism, and they were fighting for the working class. And during World War II, the communists became a really, really essential part of the fight against the Nazis. Henry Wallace, who was the vice president of the United States, openly praised Stalin and said Stalin was great, and talked about how eventually they wanted to create some kind of socialist system after the fall of the Soviet Union. They wanted to create after the defeat of the Nazis. They wanted to create a century for the common man. Roosevelt even proposed an economic bill of rights, right? Before he died. During World War II, Roosevelt, in his last State of the Union address before he died, Roosevelt came forward and he said that everyone should have the right to a job and the right to housing and the right to education. I will show, this is Roosevelt proposing, the president of the United States proposing that we should have an economic bill of rights, that our bill of rights for freedom is good, but we also need economic rights in addition to civil rights, civil liberties. We need an economic bill of rights. And that, there were Hollywood movies honoring Stalin and honoring the Soviet people. And, this was all very, very important. This is FDR's economic bill of rights speech, right? This is the president of the United States. This isn't Michael Moore saying this, right? This isn't some liberal saying this. This is FDR.
In our day, certain economic proofs have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment.
Yeah, that's the president of the United States basically saying everyone should have the right to a job, everyone should have the right to health care. I mean, every old person should have a pension. That's big, right? And it was because they were aligned with the Soviet Union. And the point is that the communists didn't sound like communists anymore, right? And that communism from Karl Marx's time was very much tainted with the aesthetic of rebellion and the aesthetic of anger and rebellion. There's two very good books I recommend: Marx and Freud, A Dialectical Study, by Reuben Osborne, and his follow-up book, The Psychology of Reaction. And in those books, he basically says that the communist movement, and he wrote these books in 1939, right? The same year that this happened, when the communist movement was dramatically changing its messaging style. And he says that the communist movement has a big problem because it appeals to people's unhealthy emotions, right? It appeals to people's libidinal and Oedipal feelings, right? Your libido is your rage and sex drive, right? Anger, violence, and sex are linked to each other, right? And your libido is, everyone has anger within them and everyone has a sex drive. And your Oedipal feelings is that the feeling of every teenager wants to murder their parents at some point. That's just a normal thing. Teenagers really get mad at their parents. They really, part of growing up is you need to get out on your own. You need to not be under your parents anymore. And so every teenager basically has the desire to kill the parent of the same sex. That's the Oedipus complex. Communism as a movement, coming out of the French Revolution, was largely a movement that appealed to people's libidinal and Oedipal desires, right? You want to cut off the head of the king. He's a tyrant. He's an oppressor. And you want to let your anger out at society. You want to have free sex, and you want to get your rage out at injustice. You want a big explosion of anger, a big explosion of free sex, and you want to cut the king's head off, and you want to take down the tyrant and all of that. And communism as a movement was appealing to people's libidinal and Oedipal complex. Well, actually, while those feelings do exist and they are part of natural human emotion, they're not, if someone is deeply libidinal or deeply Oedipal, they're not going to have a healthy way of being. And what Reuben Osborne argues in his book is that fascism at the time, was appealing to people's healthier emotions, people's love of country, their love of their homeland, their love of their community, people's desire in a lot of cases for parental transference, right? That fascism, it was appealing to the fatherland. Why do they call it the fatherland? It's supposed to remind you of your love of your parent. And that fascism was appealing to people's desire to belong, to be part of a community, etc. And that fascism was leading people to do very, very evil things, but it was appealing to much healthier emotions. And that what Reuben Osborne argued, and what the communist movement clearly did during the Roosevelt years and during the Popular Front, was that they were trying to change their appeal and not appeal to people's libidinal and Oedipal feelings, but rather to their more healthy emotions, their desire for community, their love of their parents, their love of their country, their homeland. And that communism, in order to win, basically, it started looking like this. And instead of the red flag and the guillotine and all of that, it was love, friendship between the USA and the USSR, loving Abraham Lincoln, loving your country. That's much healthier emotions. And that's what Reuben Osborne argues. The aesthetics, the spiritual vibe of communism changed. And I often talk about Superman, right? The Superman comic books. No one would ever think that they were communist, right? How could that be communist? Well, at the time they came out, Superman, he was the man of steel. And, how do you say man of steel in Russian? Stalin, right? And Superman, he went around rescuing striking workers, went around fighting the Ku Klux Klan, denouncing racism. Superman was very much in line with the Popular Front. Maybe he wasn't a Communist Party member, but he liked the Soviet Union. He hated racism. He loved labor unions. He was for truth, justice, and the American way. And, the communist movement largely changed its appeal to not be about rage and vengeance and killing the king and unleashing your sexual desires, and instead to be about feelings of community, feelings of brotherhood, etc., so that fascists couldn't, use those feelings for evil, right? Very interesting. But anyway, so that's Marxism-Leninism. And so after World War II, right, Marxism-Leninism massively spread over the world, and it was a large section of the world was run by Marxism-Leninism. But even before World War II, right, let's keep this in mind. So as the Popular Front was happening, and as the global communist movement was moving into its patriotic, its patriotic mode, right? What was happening in the Soviet Union? Well, there was a horrendous event in the Soviet Union called the Great Terror, right? 1937. It was awful. And it was basically a mass panic in the country about Nazi spies, right? They feared that Nazi spies were infiltrating the country, and they were actually. There were Nazi spies in the country. And, there was a Soviet official who was assassinated, Sergei Kirov. And there was mass panic about Nazi spies. And what happened? Well, in response to this mass panic about Nazi spies, people got mean to each other, and people started turning in their neighbors. And people would be held in suspicion if they said something that someone thought was not communist. And basically a lot of people were thrown in prison camps, and a lot of people were executed who shouldn't have been. And everyone admits this. Even the biggest admirers of Stalin admit this. And Stalin actually executed the guy who was the head of the secret police during the Great Terror, Yezhov, right? The guy named Yezhov was running the secret police. And eventually Stalin gave Yezhov the death penalty because it got so out of control. But even according to some of Stalin's biggest admirers and supporters, it's very clear that thousands and thousands of innocent people got hurt. There was an atmosphere of panic. People were turning in their neighbors. If you said something, if you made a joke or you said something, you could be held in suspicion. And that basically they created an atmosphere where people were telling on each other. It was cancel culture, but except much more vicious. You got killed. Where people were telling on each other, where people were turning each other in, where you got points for turning somebody else in. It was a really, really ugly atmosphere. And it was a very horrendous period. The Great Terror. And the fear was very justified. There were plenty of international saboteurs and Nazi spies in the Soviet Union. But at the same time, the population was kind of whipped up into this fit of like vengeance and all of that. It was very, very bad. And after World War II, China and the Soviet Union had their falling out. And in China, after China and the Soviet Union had their falling out, China wanted to prove it was ultra-communist, and they had a similar event. It was a little bit different, but it was along similar lines. It was called the Cultural Revolution. When in China, they mobilized the young people, the teenagers, as Red Guards to go out and try and purify China and make China purely communist and just go around looking for anything that was not in line with communism and burning it down and tearing it down. And they destroyed a lot of the classical temples and ancient ruins and monuments in China because it was the ancient non-communist way of doing things. And they went after women who wore makeup because they said that was bourgeois decadence. And at one point they went to where all the foreign diplomats lived, and they executed their pets because they said owning pets was mimicking slavery or something. And it was really awful, right? And the Cultural Revolution was this attempt to make China purely communist by appealing to people's Oedipal and libidinal feelings, right? And it was, students were going after their teachers, and kids were turning in their parents, and it was revenge, and it is right to rebel was the slogan. And the Cultural Revolution in China was pretty horrible. It was pretty awful. And in 1976, they ended the Cultural Revolution, and they arrested Jiang Qing, the leader of Mao's wife. They blamed her for the Cultural Revolution. Those were two events, the Great Terror of 1937 and the Cultural Revolution, that really kind of showed that spiritual aesthetic that communism had been appealing to, the Oedipal and libidinal drive, right? That drive doesn't go to healthy places. And if it's unleashed, it can really lead people to really hurt each other. Now, after the Second World War, the communist countries exist. There's all kinds of different communist countries, and many countries industrialize, wipe out illiteracy, pave the roads, build huge power plants, etc. But after that, they develop a bit of a problem, which is that, once you have paved the roads and laid the foundations of modern industrialization, then if everybody is a government employee and everyone is getting paid by the government, and a kind of atmosphere sets in where you don't have innovation, you don't have creativity, because new ideas, that's too much paperwork for the bureaucrats, right? And anyone who's ever worked in government or worked in bureaucratic organizations knows what this is like. That if you have a really good idea, right, some bureaucrat and has to approve it. They're not going to approve it because it's more paperwork, it's more time for them, right? And that the Soviet Union was really good at making steel. It was really good at building power plants, really good at its space program, really good at weapons, AK-47, but it was not good at clothing, right? Clothing. They could never keep up with the West because, people, how do you know what clothes to make? Well, that's based on who buys it, who votes with their dollars, what people purchase. Children's toys, they could never keep up with. And consumer goods, the things that make life fun, the Soviet Union really couldn't keep up with that. And the Western countries very much, they boycotted the Soviet Union. It was barricaded. And, consumer goods, blue jeans, Beatles records, all the fun stuff. The West was this fun place full of consumer goods. And the communist countries were countries where there was no unemployment. There was no one went without health care. There was universal literacy and all of that. They had lifted up from third world conditions, but they didn't have all the fun stuff that you have in the West, right? They had a lot more economic security, but they didn't have all the fun stuff that you have in the West. And that became an issue. Furthermore, there was a layer of people in the Soviet Union that were very high achieving people that were completely stifled, right? And you see this, right? In many communist countries, you go there and there's somebody who is really smart, right? And really high achieving, but it doesn't get them anything. You go to Cuba even now, right? You'll see there's many bitter people in Cuba that are doctors, but because of the socialist system, they don't have room for them in the medical system, right? You can meet a taxi driver who's got a medical degree. He could be a doctor, but the Cuban medical system doesn't have room for him, right? And so he's stuck driving a taxi. And, you meet people like that. That's the kind of bitterness, right? Where there's people that are college professors, people that are filmmakers, people that are writers, people that are engineers, people that are, high achieving individuals that kind of feel trapped. And that's what the Berlin Wall was about, right? Most people in East Germany didn't want to leave, but the people who were high achieving did want to leave, right? And that the Berlin Wall was there to keep them in. Right? It was there to, basically say, no, we need engineers, we need scientists, we need doctors in the Soviet Union. No, you can't just get up and leave. Your average factory worker did not want to leave, but, your high achieving person did want to leave and go to the West where they could make more money. And that there were a lot of people in the Eastern Bloc who felt very stifled, right? They were very trapped. And on top of that, these countries are barricaded. They're militarily surrounded. They don't have the same type of freedom that we have in the West, right? You can't, if you're seen as being against the Communist Party, you can be disappeared in the middle of the night. Right. And that they don't have the same level of freedom, and the high achieving people feel stifled. And that eventually it was those high achieving people, those artists, those filmmakers, it was the most privileged people in the country, often the children of the party elite. They became in awe of the West. And they were convinced that the Western capitalist countries were amazing. The Western capitalist countries were awesome. And they went out in 1989 and they overthrew the government of Czechoslovakia, and they overthrew the government of East Germany, and they overthrew the government of Romania, and eventually they overthrew the government of the Soviet Union. And these countries lost their socialist system. And again, a lot of the people who went out and protested to bring down the Soviet Union didn't want free market capitalism. They wanted socialism, but to have the ability to shop at Walmart, the ability to drink Coca-Cola, the ability to, wear blue jeans, right? And they wanted the ability to have more freedom when it came to making movies. What they didn't realize is that in America, for a big studio to make your movie, you're going to get censored way more than any government bureaucracy in the USSR is going to censor you, right? In the Soviet Union, there's political limitations on what you can say. In America, if you work for a big studio, they're going to regulate everything because their money is on the line. But that's a whole nother story. But the Soviet Union was overthrown, Eastern Europe was overthrown, and the economic results were disastrous. And that's one thing, again, right? Again, all these people who go on about, oh, communism is so bad. The fall of the Soviet Union was an economic disaster. The fall of the Soviet Union led to a rapid drop in living standards, a rapid drop in life expectancy, mass unemployment. People were mass unemployment. People were dying. I mean, the life expectancy went down. Russia lost like 10% of its population. And again, this is why this is a very nuanced conversation we're having here, right? We're not saying communism all good. We're being honest about, what's going on, but we're also not buying into the standard American anti-communist bullshit. Oh, communism was just so horrible. And in the 90s, it was great all across Eastern Europe. People got freedom. Bullshit. All right. There was read Naomi Klein, right? Read Naomi Klein, the shock doctrine, the mass unemployment, mass hunger, the suicide rate went through the roof. It was a disaster. The fall of the Soviet Union, the whole country was economically demolished, right? And and the free market, it devastated the place. So let's be honest about this. And again, this is why, for a long time, I was very much a dogmatic believer. I thought that the Stalinist way of doing things was the best way of doing things, that we just adopted the Stalin thing, because no one ever acknowledged the huge achievements of the Stalin era, number one, and no one ever acknowledged the failures of capitalism when capitalism was restored in the USSR. The returning of capitalism to Eastern Europe was an absolute nightmare and disaster by all economic measure. Mass death, mass unemployment, mass hunger, and they never acknowledge that. All these people, it's just this standard American thing. Oh, communism, communism is just a big failure and capitalism is the best. Well, then why didn't things get better when the Soviet Union fell? So, this is a nuanced conversation here, okay? We're acknowledging that the Soviet Union fell for a reason, that they stagnated, people felt trapped, those intellectuals couldn't do what they did. When it came to consumer goods, Coca-Cola and clothing, blue jeans, and they didn't have the freedom, and there was a lot of problems that led to the fall of the USSR. But there's this, again, you want to avoid black and white thinking, right? The world is much more complicated than that. And the black and white thinking, it's because of the black and white thinking that I was attracted to communism to begin with, because I could see through the lies I was being told. They said the Soviet Union never achieved anything. Communism's just never done anything good anywhere. That's just not true. And the fall of the Soviet Union, bringing in free market capitalism in the 90s, was an absolute disaster, right? And they never acknowledged that either. There's this ignorance that every American thinks they know about communism. They know that the Soviet Union was an utter hellhole that never achieved anything. That's not true. They also know that capitalism is this great system. That's not true either. It's complicated. So anyway, the Soviet Union fell. China did not fall. China is still run by the Communist Party. Why? Because in 1976, after Mao died, they started saying, what can we do to not have the problems that the Soviet Union had? And they developed a new economic system, a new economic model called socialism with Chinese characteristics, where the government controls the banks and the government has 5-year plans, but they allow private investment. And in fact, the government helps set up corporations, and they find the engineers and the scientists, and they give them funding to start their own businesses and start up enterprises. And it's a new economic system where the government, it's not free market. The economy is still run by the state and planned by the state, but they use the market, and they don't stifle the innovation of the young people and of the new people. They invest in it and they promote it, and the government has the responsibility to oversee economic growth and utilizing the market to build an overall strong economy, right? A big market sector, but a popular state that comes out of an anti-colonial revolution in charge. And in China, they adjusted their system. And in China today, right, they have 5-year economic plans. And they have built the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. They have the world's largest steel industry. They've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They have the world's largest hydroelectric power plants. They've paved roads even in the most rural areas. What China has achieved with this model of a highly market-friendly socialism, a planned economy that facilitates economic growth and uses the market to raise people up out of poverty, what China has done has been very, very, very successful. No country in the world has ever lifted as many people out of poverty as China. And this model that was kind of pioneered, Deng Xiaoping theory, China's reform and opening up, socialism with Chinese characteristics, is very successful. Now, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and in Latin America and Eastern Europe, they imposed insane free market policies, right? And in Latin America, it was an absolute disaster. In Ecuador, I was in Ecuador in 1999. The IMF forced them to sell off their state-run oil company, forced them to adopt the US dollar as their currency. It was a disaster. In Bolivia, they had to auction off their water. They privatized their water, and it was an absolute disaster. In Eastern Europe, you had mass sex trafficking and poverty. And, the 1990s was a very difficult time because of neoliberalism. In response to neoliberalism, you got a wave of opposition. And in Russia, it took the form of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said, look, the neoliberalism, the free market stuff has gotten out of control. And he took office and he said, I'm going to take the oil and the natural gas and I'm going to put them under state control. And he created two state-run energy companies, Gazprom and Rosneft, and put them at the center of the economy and used government-controlled energy revenue, the money from oil and gas, to rebuild the economy. And Russia's economy is very planned, but there's a huge market sector, a lot of very wealthy people, right? And it's a lot like China, right? Where China, again, they have the government, controls the economy, but there's a huge market, right? And that's what they have in Russia, right? It's very much inspired by Deng Xiaoping theory. And in Venezuela, you had the rise of Hugo Chavez, and he took control of the oil and he used the oil money to stabilize the Venezuelan economy, to build up the Venezuelan economy, etc. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas took power once again, and they implemented these kind of policies. And now all over the world, you have countries that have what you can call 21st century socialism, which is they have a government that comes out of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution. They control their natural resources. They control their banks and their lending of money. They have state central planning, but they have a huge market sector. They have all kinds of private companies. They have all kinds of private enterprises. They start worker cooperatives. They subsidize people to start their own businesses. And the state plans the economy, but it uses the market as a mechanism for making the country wealthy. And that model, that's what most of the BRICS countries have. Now, not all of them. India is not like that, and, but the basis of the BRICS stuff, is 21st century socialism. What they have in China, what they have in Russia, what they have in Venezuela, what they have in Iran, what they just adopted, in West Africa. The Union of Sahel States, Ibrahim Traore is moving towards this kind of system. And these are countries where an anti-colonial state plans the economy and oversees economic growth by investing in people, right? And that model is very, very effective, and that is the rising economy. So that brings us to where we are today with innovationism. The Center for Political Innovation, we have an understanding that incorporates all of this, and we're not classical Marxist, Leninist communists. But we haven't abandoned anti-imperialism. We haven't abandoned the struggle to raise people out of poverty and defeat imperialism. We haven't abandoned defense of the countries that have broken out of imperialism. We fight for working families. What is innovationism? What does innovationism stand for? Well, this is basically what we've got. These are the 5 things that we've got. Number 1, we celebrate human growth and creativity. There's something special about human beings. No other species is capable of doing what human beings can do. Human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel, artificial intelligence, and iPhones in just 8,000 years. Bees are still making their beehives the same way they were 8,000 years ago. And ants are still making their ant farms the same way they were 8,000 years ago. No species is like human beings. We have the ability to innovate, to reinvent the world around us, and force the environment to serve us. And Marx knew that. Marx talked about this. Frederick Engels talked about this, but they weren't the first ones. This is in the Bible, right? God says to man, go forth and take dominion over the earth, be fruitful and multiply. This is in ancient Greek mythology. They talk about Prometheus, right, who gave man the ability to make fire, gave man the ability to innovate, right? And there's something special about human beings. We are not just another animal. We have within us a spark of divinity, right? If you define God as the creator, what separates human beings from animals is that we have creativity, right? We have a godlike ability to be creative. And again, Marx knew this. And if you read Friedrich Engels in his essay about the role of labor in the transition from ape to man, and if you read Marxism, this is actually, a foundational belief that Marxists have. They just kind of forgot about it, right? They just kind of don't emphasize it. But if you read Marx, right, the whole understanding of the labor theory of value, all of this is in Marx, right? And this is an important part of Marxism, but it's deeper than that. It's a spiritual point. It's the basis, I think, of, Christianity acknowledges it. Ancient Greeks recognized it. This is a metaphysical spiritual point that human beings have creative ability. We are the innovative species. We are the tool-making species. We have a spark of creativity, and that defines our humanness, and that we are constantly reinventing our relationship with nature and advancing toward a higher mode of existence, increasing our life expectancy, increasing our population, making life more comfortable. No species has the ability to take dominion and be fruitful and multiply the way we do. And that is very, very special, right? And that's something to celebrate about humanity. So that's the first point. And again, that's not contrary to anything that Marx said, but it's not emphasized in Marx as much as we emphasize it too. We are opposed to imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage. Now, some people call it globalism, and some people use the word imperialism. We've started using globalism/imperialism because if you just say imperialism, people think woke, right? People think imperialism is about white privilege, or imperialism is this woke people use the word imperialism and they don't know what it means, right? And it's just, oh, you're being so imperialistic, you're being mean to me. And, they don't know what it means. And, we're referring to an economic system that Lenin described, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. People on the right talk about globalism. And a lot of them are talking about this system, but then they tend to mix it in with conspiracy theories, and it's the Illuminati, and it's Satanists, and they're going to drink the blood of a goat and sacrifice children. We're not doing that. So when we say globalism/imperialism, or imperialism/globalism, it's clear we're talking about an economic system of big banks and monopolies dominating the world. And we oppose that system. And the main push of that system right now is Malthusianism, degrowth. That's what the World Economic Forum is pushing. That's what the big banks and monopolies are pushing. They're pushing degrowth. They want to reduce the human population. They say there's too many people in the world. And it's not really about the environment. It's about the fact that they can only stay at the top of the hill if human growth ends, right? Imagine the game King of the Mountain, right? One kid's at the top and he says, game over because I'm at the top. That's what they're doing. And so Malthusianism, depopulating the planet, degrowth, reducing consumption, all of that is what imperialism, globalism, imperialism is resorting to in order to hold on to power, right? And that's why they beat down countries. These wars that they wage are to beat down countries, right? These countries, like Libya was the most prosperous country in Africa, but the imperialists beat down Libya and destroyed Libya. And now it's in ruin, and people are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out. It doesn't have electrification. Libya has been destroyed by imperialism, right? After the fall of the Soviet Union, they degrew the Soviet Union, closed down the factories, mass unemployment, and then Putin came to power and rebuilt it, right? And that, imperialism is about degrowth, right? And Malthusianism is the economic theory that says growth is bad. And we're opposed to that. And we understand that globalism, imperialism is becoming desperately Malthusian in order to stay in power. That's something we understand. And that, again, Marx spent a lot of his writing opposing Malthusianism, and Lenin, a Marxist, but again, a deviant Marxist, he developed the theory of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So, is that contrary? I don't know, but it's, we're focusing on opposing globalism, imperialism, and Malthusianism. Point number 3, we call for a pro-growth, pro-humanity state. We need a government of action that will fight for working families, and I think that that's basically what all the countries around the world that have broken out of imperialism have. They have anti-monopoly governments. They have governments that are pro-growth, pro-humanity, invest in people, and come out of an anti-imperialist revolution and build up. They have planned economies, 5-year economic plans to build up their people. That's what we need here. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That's what we need in America. There you go. And in order to fight for that, we want to build an anti-monopoly coalition. Now, those words, anti-monopoly coalition, that's the Communist Party in the 1950s. Around the time, maybe a decade or so after this, the Communist Party was for that, right? And they wanted to build a coalition against the imperialist monopolies, right? And that's what we want to do. And that there are divisions within the ruling class, and we seek to utilize those divisions to build an anti-monopoly coalition. And again, I mean, is that communist or not? I mean, I don't know. And then the final thing is that we have a psychoanalytical and spiritual approach. We reject the libidinal and Oedipal politics, right? We understand that the aesthetics that leftism appeals to, the desire to burn it down and tear it down and punish people and rage and vengeance and free sex and Oedipal, kill your parents, that isn't going to build a healthy movement. And it was weaponizing those deviations, that deviant way of thinking, that led to destroying the Soviet Union and Khrushchevism and the way they brought down and manipulated and destroyed the global communist movement in a lot of ways. And woke politics is libidinal Oedipal politics. We want to build a constructive politics based on people's love of community, love of family, love of society. We're not trying to appeal to people to rebel and get revenge. We're trying to appeal to people's love and kindness and loyalty, etc. So, those 5 points are what defines us. And we are basically continuing the struggle against globalism, imperialism, where, learning what went on in the 20th century. We understand why the Soviet Union fell. We understand why China adjusted to be the way it is. We understand why the left have lost their minds and are no longer anti-imperialist and are destructive. And with innovationism, we have a new understanding that gives us the ability to build a completely new movement. So, you ask, are we just rebranding communism? No, we're not, right? We have something of our own, right? This isn't just communism rebranded. This is something new. But have we put communism in the toilet? Have we just, we're all just a bunch of Trumpers now? No, we're not, right? We are anti-imperialist, anti-globalist. We are fighting for working families. We want a government, a pro-growth, pro-humanity state. We see that there's divisions in the ruling class. We want to build an anti-monopoly coalition. We have an understanding of the aesthetic and psychoanalytical and spiritual weaknesses of the communist movement. We celebrate human growth and creativity. We are doing our own thing, but we're doing it on the foundation of studying and understanding what happened in the 20th century, where Marxism came from, where Marxism went. We're doing something new and exciting, and it's called innovationism. It's a set of principles that we've developed upon which we can build a successful organization. So I hope that this slideshow helped clear things up for everybody. I hope that people can understand what we're doing. I hope it was helpful. I will cut this for the YouTube channel and make it a standalone video. But yeah, this is what we're doing. We're building the innovationist movement. And we stand with all the countries around the world that are opposing imperialism. We stand for working families. We celebrate human creativity. We are opposed to globalism, imperialism, and we want to build an anti-monopoly coalition and eventually create a government of action that will fight for working families.